Hello, everybody. This week we are going to focus on decimals. Um, you might remember back when we did Number Corner, we actually started doing some stuff with decimals. So hopefully this will just be a nice little review of that and we'll kind of take it a couple steps further. This is really the last big topic we needed to cover for fourth grade. So we are actually getting this done. This week is going to be slightly different in that I'm actually going to try to do everything 90% of it actually in the Google Slides, just like you will. Decimals work much better for this than fractions did, so hopefully you'll have an easier time with this. These Google Slides, again, in order for everyone to get their own, I've actually made several. I've made it an assignment. When it's an assignment, you get your own. That also means it gives you the option to turn in. This particular assignment is not the one I'm checking to see if what you did for the week. These are for you to practice to make sure you understand the concepts so that you can do the assignment for this week, which is the crime scene. So if you need to turn this in so that it's off your to-do list, that's okay. Just know this is not what I'm looking for. Make sure you do the crime scene. And there's going to be another video with instructions on that so that you know what's happening. Okay, so I am going to show you the Google Docs slides that you should be following along with, but I'm going to show you mine that I'm working on. Okay, so I started off with this nice big blue screen telling you that you need to be following along with this video. And since you can hear me, good job. All right, so let's get into some decimals. The second slide here shows the place value chart. We talked about this, if you remember. Over here in the greens, these are our standard whole numbers. We have ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. And then we talked about how we have this decimal point in the middle. And then over here, we have our decimal place values. And I kind of put this red box to represent, we talked about that mirror, how everything on this side reflects this side with the ones and decimal point being our little mirror here. So you see we have tenths, hundredths, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, millionths. Now, in fourth grade, I'm pretty sure we're pretty much going to hundredths, maybe thousandths, but I figured you could see all of those in order to know, to remember them for future knowledge. Now, we're going to have to work on how we say these decimals because saying decimals properly is important. Does anybody happen to remember how we say the decimal point? What is going to be kind of funny is when you get into the crime scene, you're going to see in the crime scene that our criminal's name is Don't Say Point, because we're not going to say point when we come to that decimal point. So if you remembered, good job. But if you remember, our decimal point, his name is and. So whenever you get to the decimal point in a number, you say and. Excuse me. So let me create a number here. Okay. I have a 5, a decimal point, and 2 decimal places after that. So if I were thinking about it as up in this chart, and I don't think I can make it fit, it's a little small here. Let's see if I can. I don't know that I'll be able to make it large enough to fit this scale. It's getting there. Closer, closer, closer. Okay, that's about as close as we're going to get. All right, let me move his name up here for us. All right, so if we line up our decimal with our decimal in our number, we see that we have a 5 in the ones place, The 6 is in the tenths, and the 5 is in the hundredths. So when we say this is 5 and then the cool thing is we just say this whole number, so 65 hundredths, because hundredths is this last place value. So we would say 5 and 65 hundredths. We could have something like this. This would be 7 and 3, that whole number is just 3 hundredths. If we wanted to make it harder, we could go 6 and 563 thousandths, since our last digit is in the thousandths. This is a skill, being able to name decimals that you will need for the crime scene. So make sure you are taking a look at that. I will try to be much more proper as we go through the papers we're doing to help emphasize how to name these. When you're working on the crime scene, feel free to refer back to this chart. You can use these charts whenever you want. If I remember correctly, it might be on one of your tabs too. I can't remember if we got that far or if I gave you the decimal tab or not. But if we did, it should be in your notebook. Okay, so now that we know how to name a decimal, we can call it by its proper name. Let's kind of take a look back at fractions and decimals. So last week we talked about tenths and hundredths and putting them together. And it kind of seemed pretty simple that, hey, 4 tenths, tenths is already one of our decimal place values. So I'm going to put the 4 in the tenths place. So if I come over here to this fraction when I say it is 2 tenths. So if I'm going to say 2 tenths, that means I have a 2 in the tenths place. Now, I'm going to put the zeros in today, I think, just so that you can tell. Zeros are optional. Normally, I don't put them in, but just so the decimal point doesn't get lost, I'm going to put the zeros in today. So now, if we go to number 2 here, it says 7 100ths. So that tells me there's a 7 in the hundredths place. So this is one of those where these little charts come in handy, where we know it's hundredths, so we know we need to go out to hundredths. And it tells me the 7 is going to go in that hundredths place over here. Well, I have a problem. Oops, let me see if I can make this show up for you guys. I don't know if it'll. So if I put the 7 in that hundredths place, I still have another place value here. Whenever you have a single digit hundredths, you have to put a 0 in there. Otherwise, it becomes 7 tenths, which is a whole different thing. So make sure if it's 7 hundredths, the 7 goes in the hundredths place. So if we come to this next one, 84 100ths. 84 is a 2-digit number, so that's easy. I just fill in my 2 spots, 84. 4 100ths. Okay, so again, if I want to do this ahead of time, you want to think of it like this. I'll move my box so you can see what I just did. I know there's going to be 2 decimal places because this is hundredths. My 4 has to go in the far one, so I have to use a place filler 0 in there in order to make my number correct. If you also want to think about this, hundredths is like cents. So if you're writing money, if I wanted 2 cents, I wouldn't write it like this. That would be more than 2 cents. That would be 20 cents. So you always want to put that 0 in there. So 32 100ths, 0.32. 73 100ths again. So I know I want to fill in my 73 out to the hundredths place. 1 100th. Again, it's the hundredth, so I know that's the second place value. So these seem to be cruising right along here. 94 100ths. I think we have the hang of how to do hundredths. Okay, let's go back to tenths now. 1/10. Now, if you remember, tenths is the very first spot. So that means when we put our 1 in there, it goes in the very first spot. And so then for number 10 here, I'm going to put my put my 0 up front for you. I have 3/10. So it's 0.3. Again, the zeros are optional, but if you want to do that, you can. Now, what I have done differently in this slide presentation than in previous ones is I'm not going to say pause the video and come back. I do recommend, let me take that back. I am going to tell you to pause the video. If you feel you need more practice on this, pause the video, finish these last 10 problems. But here's the cool thing. While your video is paused, you can then go down and I have an answer section. And if you click, and I'm not going to click on it to show you the answers real big, but if you click on that first one there, it's going to show you the answers to this first page. So you're going to, if you feel that you need extra practice on naming decimals, pause the video, finish these 10, and then go check them on that last slide. Well, the first one after the answers. And I think what I might do that might make life easier as I'm looking at this, I think if you look on the side here, how there's this vertical list of all the answers, I might make that so that you can actually copy and paste that onto this page so that you don't have to constantly flip back and forth between those. But I don't want to make that, I don't want you to do that before you actually answer the questions. I will see if that's a possibility. If it's too complicated, I won't mess with it and you'll just have to go back and forth. So we'll see how that works. So far we've talked about how to name our decimals. We've converted basic fractions into decimals. Hopefully you've completed this. And so now we're going to move on to comparing fractions to a half. It's important to kind of know how much of a fraction you have. Now, as I glance down this list, most of these are in hundredths. There's a couple in tenths, so we'll get back to that. Now, if you remember, we talked about benchmark fractions before. Well, you can kind of think of this as a benchmark decimal. Why do we need to know this? This is what we need to know when it comes to rounding. The crime scene is going to ask you to round to the nearest whole number. Okay, so these, for the most part, are all less than 1. So the whole numbers we would round to would either be 0 or 1. In the crime scene, there'll be bigger numbers. But in order to determine whether you would round up to the next number or down to the previous number, we need to know which side of a half, whether it be 4.5, 5.5, or just a half, your decimal is. So if we think about this, money works way easier. So if we think about a dollar is 100 cents. How much is half of a dollar? Well, hopefully you said that half of a dollar is 50 cents. So 0.50 is 1/2 of 100 of a dollar, of one whole. And you guys know, you've looked at this, you've seen this a million times, you know that this is 1/2. So as we're looking at these, we have to decide, is this decimal greater than, less than, or equal to 0.50? Okay, so 0.95 is more than 50 cents. which means we would round this up to 1 whole. Let's do another example here just to be a little more in with what our assignment's going to be. What if we had 6.95? And it told us to round this to the nearest whole number. Yeah, let me put this up here. We'll make this nice and big and bold and bright, and so we know that's our magic benchmark we're looking for. We'll put it there. Okay. So if I wanted to round 6.95 to the nearest whole number, I have to know if 0.95 is greater than half. Since it is, I know that this would then round to 7. Okay, so let's try the next one. 0.72. So I have 72 hundredths. Is that at least 50 hundredths? Yes. So that's more. And then if I want to, let's say our problem was 12.72. And I wanted to round that to the nearest whole number. Since this was more than half, I will go up to 13. If you want to add these text boxes on yours like I did, I'll do it by hand one more time so you can see what I did. Okay, 0.87, 87 100ths. That is more than half. So I'm going to put in more. I'm going to, so if you want to add your own text box, you go up here to the T, and then you just kind of draw your box. And I'm going to call this one, let's make it 459.87. Now, to get that little arrow, this was kind of nifty how it changed it. I did 2 dashes, which is the button next to the 0. And then I actually did a greater than symbol, which is you hold shift and hit down your period. When you hit space, it should convert that into a nice little arrow for you. If it doesn't, sorry, but it should. If it's doing it on mine, I imagine it should do it on yours. Okay, so 459 and 87 hundredths. If I want to round this to the nearest whole number, again, I'm looking, is this more than half? 87 100ths is more than 50 100ths. So I'm going to round that up, and so this is going to go to 460. Hopefully that makes sense to you. I do want to jump down. I'm going to kind of jump around on this one. Let's go down and look at number 9 here. So number 9, I have 8 100ths. Well, 8 100ths is less than 50 100ths. So this is less than 1/2. And if I want to do an example, by the way, to just do that, I did Control C, Control V. But there's also a really cool thing that I have learned that you can do Control D, and it should just duplicate for you without having to do V and P and stuff. So new trick. I just learned it during this online distance learning stuff. Okay, so let's make a super big number. 12,946.08. All right. So I want to round this to the nearest whole number. So again, we looked at this. This was less than half, which means I'm going to, we call it rounding down. I'm not real fond of that term, but we're going to choose the lower option. So 12,946. So essentially just the decimal section drops off. All right, so those are all in hundredths. That's all well and good. But what happens if we have tenths? What if we're trying to round and we only have tenths? Well, Instead of 51 hundredths, if we only had tenths, well, what's half of tenth or half of 10? So in this case, 0.5. So 0.5, 5/10 is that magic number, that midway point. If we had thousandths, what do you think it would be? Hopefully you said 500 thousandths because 500 is halfway to 1,000. So whenever you're rounding to the nearest whole number, the nice thing is you only need to know that middle benchmark, that mid number, and then decide whether it's higher or lower. Again, on the answer sheet down there, all the mores and lesses will be written. There won't be all the rounding. That was kind of something we just added on. But you will have to round to the nearest whole number in the crime scene. Again, if you want to practice this a little more, you're not sure, go ahead, hit pause, fill these in, go down and check your answers. Then come back and we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so we know how to compare decimals to the nearest, in order to be able to round it. So we know whether it's more than a half, less than a half. But in this case, we're going to have to start being able to compare our answers with other decimals. So how are we going to compare these? So there's a couple things. Number one, I'm going to see if I can change how I'm presenting this to make it a little different. We're going to share my entire screen this time. I'm going to minimize me though, so you don't see that. You don't need that. And I have my visualizer, that's what this is called, that is going to show what I'm doing on my desktop with a pen, well, marker, so that you can see what I'm doing, because this part is a little easier with pen and paper. All right, so up here it says we have 5 and 78 hundredths and 5 and 68 hundredths. Well, hopefully, in your head, you're like, well, 5 and 78 hundredths and 5 and 68 hundredths. Well, 78 hundredths is more than 68 hundredths. So hopefully that one's kind of self-explanatory. To get the greater than symbol, that's shift period. That'll get you the greater than symbol. It is pronounced greater than because that's what you're saying. 5 and 78 hundredths is greater than 5 and 68 hundredths. Okay. So now we look at this next one. And I bet if I gave you a second, in fact, go ahead, make your prediction. We have 9 and 12 hundredths. And we have 9 and 7 tenths. If your gut instinct told you that 9 and 12 hundredths is larger, you fell for the trap. Whenever we are comparing decimals, you must have the same number of decimal places. Remember how when we compared fractions, we said you had to have the same denominator? Well, let's think about that. That one says it's 12 100ths. This says 7 tenths. Those are not the same denominators. I can't compare them like that. In order to compare these, I have to make them both have the same number of decimals. Well, what number could I possibly fill in there? Well, if we were doing this in fractions and we wanted to convert this to hundredths, we would multiply both the top and bottom by 10. So essentially, you just get to fill in placeholder zeros. So now, which of those is larger, 9 and 12 hundredths or 9 and 70 hundredths? Aha, 70 hundredths is definitely larger. So in this case, I'm going to use the less than symbol. That one is shift comma. And again, it's pronounced less than because it is saying that the first number is less than the second number. Okay. So again, as you are doing these, you must remember you have to have the same number of decimal places. So number 8 is an excellent example of one that students often miss. So I have 2 6/10, and I have 2 60/100. Your gut might tell you 60/100 sounds a lot bigger, but when we fill in our extra 0 to make sure they have the same decimals, you find out they are actually equal to each other. So for number 8, when we go to put the equal in here, equal is there's a plus sign and an equal sign. The cool thing is you just have to hit the button once, and that'll give you the equal sign. Again, I'm making mine centered. You don't have to do that because it's only for you. Okay, so I hope this is making sense to you. Make sure whenever you are comparing decimals, you have the same number of decimal places, and then you can just look at it. But here's one. This one's not on the paper, but just kind of want to throw this one out there just in case you might fall for it. So I have 5 25/100 and 3 25/100. Don't get so carried away looking at the decimals that you kind of miss the whole numbers. A whole number of 5, no matter how many hundredths you have, is going to be larger than something that has a whole number of 3. If you think of this in terms of money, if I have $5 and whatever amount of cents, that's going to be more than $3. So make sure you don't get so carried away looking at the decimals that you forget about the whole numbers. They matter too. Again, if you have other questions about this that I didn't answer, feel free to request a Google Meet or send me a written question. I'm happy to help. I know this is hard learning this stuff, just kind of me talking at you, not the best way. Normally, I would prefer to have you do a couple so I could walk around and see what you're actually doing, but unfortunately, that's not possible. So we're doing the best we can. Again, if you want to practice some of these, the answer sheet is then listed below. You can go back and check your answers. All right, the last bit of topic. This is actually more of a 5th grade topic, um, but it's important for one of the scenes in the crime scene. So I figured, why not? Let's learn something a little more advanced and see what we can do with it. So adding and subtracting decimals, again, not something you really need to know at this level, but let's see if my other eraser is any better. Oh no, camera kaput. Okay. I'm going to jump around on this sheet just because I want to start with addition, and they kind of started with subtraction. So let's go down to number 5. So number 5 says 68 18/100, and I'm adding it to. And that's a little out of focus, isn't it? See if I can focus that. Much better. Okay. Ooh, how do I get to the answer sheet? I want that. Okay. Well, that's going to be as close as it gets. Okay, so 68 18/100 plus 11 and 66 hundredths. Whenever you are adding or subtracting decimals, this only works for adding and subtracting, you want to make sure you line up the decimal points. Think of it the same way as when we're comparing. How when we're comparing, we want to have the same amount of decimals so that we're using the same place values. When we add and subtract, we want to do that also. So in this case, 68 and 18 hundredths. Please notice that I'm about to write this vertically. This is one where I do highly recommend you have a paper and pencil, because trying to add these horizontally does not work very well. You need to write them vertically. So when I write this one is also in hundredths, so that's okay. Those just line up perfectly. My decimals are lined up. And then from here, I add just like I've always added. 8 and 6 is 14. Carry my 1, 6, 7, 8. Now in this case, my decimal point just falls right into place. And then I keep going. So 79 and 84 100ths. Not so bad, right? And that one was nice because they all actually lined up. But what if, for example, we wanted to do, let's try a hard one. Let's do number 7. So number 7 says we have 94 and 364 thousandths plus 47 and 9 tenths. So I know my 47 and 9 tenths is going to go there. Technically, you don't have to fill in the extra zeros, but if you're like me, that looks really weird and I don't like it. So I'm going to fill in my placeholder zeros so that my number looks normal. When we get to subtraction, you're going to have to. So that's why I recommend for addition, just get in the habit of doing it now. So then we just add 4, 6, 12, carry the 1, 11, 12, carry the 1, 9, 10, 14, 142 and 264 thousandths. For some of you who are not the neatest writers, this is where we start to get into where doing math neatly matters. Your decimal points have to be lined up. All right, so those are addition. Those seem pretty straightforward. Make sure you have the same number of decimal places. It doesn't matter if the whole numbers have the same number. You can add 100 and something plus 20. That's okay. You know how to add that. But let's get into some subtraction. In fact, I'm just going to glance down at number 11. And when you first glance at number 11, you might think that's going to be negative. But if we actually write out the problem, we're going to see it's not. So 99 and 35 hundredths minus 54, because that's our whole number, and 590 thousandths. So I need to make sure that I line up my decimals again. Now, for subtraction, because this is a 0, again, they've made it so that my rules aren't as mandatory, but they are. So, I never entered. Okay. So I am going to fill in my placeholder 0. Now 0 minus 0 is still 0, so it wasn't that mandatory on this one, but it will be on others. So you need to make sure you do it. All right, so then 5 minus 9 I can't do. I have to go next door and regroup. Remember, this means I'm borrowing 10 tenths, which makes this into 15 hundredths, which makes that a 6. The same thing here. I have to go next door. That becomes an 8. This becomes 12 minus 5. 8 minus 4, 9 minus 5. So I end up with 44 and 760 thousandths. And just like with any other subtraction, you can always check your answer by adding. So I take my difference, add, technically it's called the subtrahend, but nobody uses that. And if I add these back up, 8 and 5 is 13, 8, 9, 9. I should get that very same number I started with, and I did, so therefore I know I did my work correctly. So don't be afraid to check your work. Did I put that in there yet? Yeah, okay. All right, I want to do one more subtraction problem for you so that you can see. And we're going to go jump right back up to number 1, where we should have started. So I have 42 and 1/10, and I want to subtract 26 and 357 thousandths. Okay, well, to do this, I have to fill in my placeholder zeros. I cannot just pretend there's nothing there. Because in order to subtract these, I need them to be the same place value. Now, I can't take 7 away from 0. He goes next door. That guy can't help him. He goes next door again. I am taking 10 tenths, which becomes, so when I take this, excuse me, I'm borrowing 1/10, which becomes 10 100ths. Now I can take one from here to pass down to the first guy. 10 minus 7 is 3. 9 minus 5 is 4. 0 minus 3, uh-oh, can't do that. Need to regroup again. That becomes 10 there. That's a 7. Oh, man, look at all this regrouping. I can't subtract there. Got to go next door. Now, remember, when I'm borrowing, stealing, as I call it, from the tens place, I'm borrowing a whole 10. So I'm like borrowing, it's like borrowing $10. Except for instead of a $10 bill, I'm giving you 10 ones. You already had a 1. Therefore, you now have 11 ones. So make sure you get that correct. Subtract, we get 5, 1. So my answer for this one is 15 and 743 thousandths. All right, I know this is complicated. I know this is kind of above level. If you are working on the crime scene and you get really hung up on it, you can use a calculator. But I figured I would show you that for addition and subtraction, I think you can do it. Now, on the crime scene, it's also going to introduce multiplication and division. We do not do that with decimals yet. That's like way later in 5th grade. When you get to those problems, you are allowed to use a calculator. Most computers, in fact, I think all computers have them built in. If you're running on an app, on a tablet, I'm sure there's an app. Worst case, if you have a phone, it's on your phone. I'm sure you have a calculator somewhere. So when it comes to multiplying and dividing decimals, please use a calculator. If you're finding adding and subtracting too difficult, it's okay. You can use a calculator. But I think most of you should be able to handle it. There are instructions throughout the crime scene that tell you when you can and can't use calculators. So don't go calculator crazy on me, just on the parts you're allowed to. Okay, that is all, I think, of decimals. Again, if any of this is still confusing you or you don't have a clue, you can go back and watch it again. You can send me a message. You could also Google any number of YouTube videos out there if you really need to. But again, you can turn this in to get it off your to-do list. But the main thing I'm checking this week is the crime scene. If you have not watched my intro video to this week, please make sure you watch that. It has lots of other important information. So that is all I have on this, and I will see you guys later.